Douglas Jung was born on February 24, 1924 in Victoria, BC. As a Chinese descendant born in the 1920s, Jung faced much discrimination. The most discouraging experience endured by 96% of these Chinese Canadians was that, despite being born in Canada, in the eyes of the Canadian government, they were not recognized as Canadian citizens. When Douglas was born, his father was required to register Douglas's birth with Canadian officials at the Department of Immigration and Colonization. This was the government division responsible for immigration regulations and prohibition of Chinese immigrants. According to the Chinese Immigration Act, passed by the Parliament of Canada in 1923, thousands of Chinese Canadians were denied Canadian citizenship, and above all, the possibility of being reunited with their families. When Douglas and his family received his official birth certificate, they were shocked to see the words, "This certificate does not establish legal status in Canada," at the bottom of this certification. Even though Jung was born in Canada, under Canadian law, he was deemed a non-person. Jung felt lost and discouraged, homeless because he could not say to which nationality he belonged, for he did not have the same rights as any other ordinary Canadian would have. The prejudice towards this minority group was based on their heritage and race as Chinese descendants. When Jung realized the situation that all Chinese Canadians were in at that time, he knew that something must be done in order for minority groups to get the recognition they deserve from the government. Simply waiting for things to change would not solve the problem. Judging by historical records from 1900 to 1923, we can learn and understand the hardships faced by many Chinese Canadians during that time. For example, between 1900 and 1903, the head tax on Chinese immigrants was raised by a multiple of 10, from $50 per person to $500. The head tax was levied on every Chinese person entering Canada. It was introduced in the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885 by the Canadian government in order to discourage Chinese immigration to Canada. Most Chinese came to Canada as laborers to work on railway construction. And after the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed, Canada didn't want or need any more Chinese immigrants. From 1901 to 1918, this tax netted $18 million collected for the Canadian government. Comparatively, during the same period of time, the Canadian government spent $10 million to promote European immigration. In addition to official discrimination, Chinese Canadians also witnessed public outrage against them. In 1907 in British Columbia, an organization called the Asiatic Exclusion League was formed with the aim of preventing people of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Indian descent from taking jobs away from Canadians. In September of that year, during the anti-Asiatic parade in downtown Vancouver, a riot broke out. 8,000 people rampaged in Chinatown, turning the place into a wasteland, proving violence and vandalism, which caused thousands of dollars of damage. After such a tragic and frightening incident, the Canadian and provincial government offered no compensation for the damages. Neither were there any apologies. The Immigration Act was constantly revised by adding further regulations so as to expand to the category of prohibited immigrants. Most of these were aimed at Chinese immigrants. The most famous was the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, which prohibited all Chinese except diplomats, students, children of Canadians, and immigrants applying under the investor class. July 1st, 1923, when this act came into effect, was marked as Humiliation Day by Chinese communities. Overseas, family members could no longer come to Canada to reunite with those who were already living in Canada. Families were separated, with minimal communication, for decades. In the 1930s or 40s, or even later, when a Canadian heard the word Chinaman, they automatically picture a cook, a waiter, a farmer, or a laundry worker, but never someone in a professional capacity such as a lawyer, doctor, or accountant. When World War II broke out, Jung and many other young Chinese Canadians were determined to show Canada that they are willing to work for whatever they wanted, which was no more than the rights and privileges intrinsic to every other Canadian citizen. Jung believed that the war offered an opportunity to serve Canada. Then, they would have a much stronger case to demand full citizenship rights. Therefore, he volunteered for the Canadian Army in 1943 at the age of 19. He, along with 13 other Chinese volunteers, was ordered to report for duty in Vancouver. They were assigned to Operation Oblivion. This was instigated by the British War Ministry under the Special Operations Executive Branch, the same branch that was in charge of clandestine campaigns behind German lines. The original plan was to send these Chinese Canadian soldiers into China to arm and train 300,000 communist soldiers against the Japanese forces. However, the operation soon turned into one of cleanup and rescue following the American bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the August of 1945, thus forcing Japan to surrender. Jung's service was rewarded with a promotion. Sergeant Douglas Jung returned to Canada to study and practice law. After only 2 years of practicing law, he received a suggestion from Colin Guest, a former classmate. Mr. Guest suggested Jung to run as provincial Progressive Conservative candidate for Vancouver Centre because many of Jung's former classmates were interested in supporting his riding. Even though he lost the riding to Social Credit candidate Leslie Peterson, his candidacy on January 9, 1956 marked the first Chinese Canadian running for any political standing in Canada. Despite the failure Jung encountered, he persevered and ultimately became the Tory MP for Vancouver Centre in 1957, the first person of Chinese descent to work in any political position. He served as MP for 6 years, and during his years in office, he established the National Productivity Council, made changes so that Canadians could collect their pension anywhere in the world, changed income tax laws so university students can have less burden on financial problems, and also extend amnesty to those who illegally immigrated to Canada under the intention of reuniting with their families. However, the most significant event during Jung's time in office was when Prime Minister Diefenbaker surprised him by sending him to the UN as a representative of the Canadian legal delegation, where his presence showed the world that Canada no longer had racial discrimination. This distinction was awarded to him exactly 50 years after the riots, and in his words, made amends to the Chinese community. Jung's political success was especially glorious because he defeated the incumbent Minister of National Defense, Ralph Campney, the sitting member of Parliament with both reputation and power. Yet Jung, as a young upstart, defeated his opponent and ended nearly 22 years of Liberal rule. Jung was elected in Vancouver Centre, which was also where the riots had broken out 50 years earlier. The night of Jung's victory was a triumph for all Chinese Canadians because they had a new hero, Douglas Jung.